Hello, welcome to my channel, Another Bibliophile Reads. My name is Greg. Today, I'm doing a video response to Brian at Bookish, who posted a video about why 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez is not considered a fantasy book, because it does have fantastical elements to the story, but it is generally regarded as literary fiction and not fantasy fiction. And why is that? Is there a certain degree of snobbery involved when people talk about fantasy fiction and they dismiss it as something lesser than literature, even though this book is considered literature by almost everyone? And according to Brian, yeah, it is sort of a fantasy novel. I'm going to be talking about genre and literature. I will not be necessarily talking just about fantasy fiction, but all genre fiction. So what is literary fiction? If you ask 10 literary critics, you're going to get 11 answers, because at least one of them is going to have two contradictory statements. But for general purposes, Finnegans Wake by James Joyce is almost always considered literary fiction. So literary, in fact, that most people cannot delve into its depths and understand what James Joyce is talking about. But it's always considered literary. Now, this book here, this is The Executioners by Nick Carter. It is a pulpy men's adventure book. There are a couple hundred books in the series. Nick Carter is listed as the author on this book. He is also the main character. This is never going to be confused as literature, at least as far as I'm concerned. This is fun, trashy fiction. It is nowhere near the level of competence of James Joyce. But can you read James Joyce Finnegans Wake? Yeah, you can, but it's going to take a whole lot of effort. Nick Carter, you can read this in a day with the brain half off and get everything out of the book that you could possibly get. So why do we consider genre something separate from literature? I'm not going to try to describe what literature is. I'm just going to show up some examples. Now, this is a science fiction novel. It is a very literary science fiction novel because it appeals to people who would sort of like James Joyce. James Joyce begins Finnegans Wake with the last half of a sentence and ends with the first half of the sentence. This science fiction novel begins with the last half of a sentence and begins with the first half of the same sentence. So there is a correlation between literature and James Joyce in this. And this book, why I think is one of the greatest science fiction novels ever written, does not get a lot of love from science fiction fans because it breaks that area where between literature and science fiction. This science fiction is not pure science fiction. It has literature in it. Sort of like that old Reese's peanut butter cup. You got chocolate in my peanut butter. No, you got peanut butter in my chocolate. People endlessly talking about what is genre and what is not genre, and can the two ever mix? And then we have books that were once considered just genre fiction, but have been elevated to literary fiction. Dashiell Hammett, The Maltese Falcon. It used to be just a plain old mystery novel, throwaway reads, but Dashiell Hammett has been elevated to the ranks of literature. You can find his books now in the Library of America that publish Hemingway and Faulkner and Edith Wharton. So Dashiell Hammett is now literature, but he's also genre fiction. And it's just kind of confusing to some people that they have to label something genre fiction or literary fiction. Now, another incident I want to talk about is Margaret Atwood's book, Oryx and Crake. In 2013, I was a member of a book group. And some of the members of the group were mentioning that they had never read a science fiction novel before. There was a moderator who led the group. Now, she had read a lot of science fiction, and I had read a lot of science fiction. So we talked to the moderator and says, let's schedule a science fiction book for our book club. And everyone said, yeah, let's do it. You know, even though they had not normally read science fiction. And at first, the moderator was thinking like Isaac Asimov. But I was the one that suggested Oryx and Crake, because that is a book that crosses over. It is science fiction and it is literature. There's actually an anecdote from about this time. There was a science fiction podcast, and it was run by 4 people who every month picked out a science fiction book, and they would read it and discuss it on their podcast. And they invited listeners to go ahead and read the book and make some comments. And they picked Oryx and Crake. And one of the founding members got incensed. He said, Oryx and Crake is not science fiction. I refuse to read that for our science fiction book group. So the science fiction podcast just did their group with 3 people that month and let him stew in his own juices. About that same time again, I was reading about a literary book club, and they picked Oryx and Crake. And one of their members said, I will not read Oryx and Crake. That book is science fiction. So now you have 2 different people who have almost certainly never met and don't know about each other's existence. One of them refusing to read Oryx and Crake because it's not science fiction. And then another person refusing to read Oryx and Crake because it is science fiction. So what is Oryx and Crake? Is it a science fiction novel or is it a literary novel? I say it is both. You can read Oryx and Crake as a science fiction novel, or you can read it as a literary novel. You don't necessarily have to pigeonhole it in one box, and it is only one thing. A book can have multiple genres attached to it, and readers can favor one genre or another and like it or not like it as they will. But it is science fiction. It is literature. And to say that it is something or it is not something is essentially doing the book a disservice, because however you look at it, Oryx and Crake is a pretty good book. I'm not going to say it's one of the all-time great books, but it's a pretty good book. And just about anyone can enjoy reading that book, whether they're primarily a science fiction reader or primarily a literary reader. It's good to be a reader that can extend over multiple genres and types of books. And that's sort of where I'm going to end, is that this whole issue is 100 Years of Solitude a fantasy novel? Maybe, maybe not. But in the end, it does not matter if it is a fantasy novel. It does not matter if it is a literary novel. It's a good novel. And people should read it as a novel and just appreciate it for what it is doing and say, yes, there are elements that are fantastical in this book that can be attributed to other genre books in fantasy, or it can be attributed to the literary facts of literature. Both are equally valid ways to read this book. And trying to decide, I only want to read fantasy is, or if you decide that I only want to read fantasy, that's the wrong way to read, in my opinion. So don't worry if this book is fantasy. or if this book is not fantasy. Don't worry if Oryx and Crake is science fiction or it is not science fiction. Just read the bloody books and don't fret too much about genre. Well, anyway, thank you for watching and keep on reading.